Time to catch up with our regular Thursday contributor to the program. She is a New South Wales Liberal Senator, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells. Connie, good morning.
Good morning, Stephen.
There's been continued opposition and now a court challenge to the biosecurity rules, which are preventing Australians from coming back from India at least until the 15th of May. This has been a real own goal by the government, hasn't it?
Look, I'm troubled by the decision, especially the precedent that it sets in making it illegal for Australians to return home to Australia. And I'm not at all surprised that it is being challenged in the federal court. And I'm most especially troubled in light of the extensive work that the committee that I chair, the Senate Standing Committee on the Scrutiny of Delegated Legislation, has done over the past year through its inquiry into the exemption of what's called delegated legislation from parliamentary oversight, including a lot of the instruments that were made during the COVID period. Now, delegated legislation is laws that are made by the executive rather than acts of the parliament. And when you think that half of the Commonwealth law, which is about 2,000 pieces per annum, is done by delegated legislation, then you can appreciate the sheer volume that's done in that way. And what is more troubling is that about 20% of that delegated legislation is not subject to a process called disallowance, which means that it is scrutinised by the Parliament and then, if required, vetoed by the Parliament. So that's really, it is a technical, there are technicalities associated here, but it is a very difficult area, and one where I think what's happened with COVID has demonstrated that the growing trend by governments to use this delegated legislation, particularly when they need to act urgently, and it doesn't receive the oversight that it should.
I think that there's a bigger concern here, and obviously that is a concern that a lot of legislation is being done through this process rather than being scrutinised by the Parliament. But it's almost like there's a delegation of responsibility too to the bureaucrats, particularly when we keep hearing this term, the health advice, but there's no transparency or explanation of what the health advice is. Like, I can't imagine that there is any health advice that says stop Australians from coming home from India. I mean, doctors wouldn't even have the wherewithal to make that decision.
Well, this is part of the reason why we undertook an investigation, an inquiry into this whole process, and our interim report focused specifically on emergency-related delegated legislation, and most especially the Biosecurity Act. And one of the recommendations in our interim report was that amendments be made to the Biosecurity Act so that the emergency requirements and the directions that can be made under the relevant sections of that Act be subject to disallowance and be subject to the scrutiny of the Parliament. Look, I accept that governments, and my committee accepts that governments need to use delegated legislation to act urgently and decisively in response to emergencies, especially in circumstances when the Parliament wasn't sitting. And you recall, Stephen, that Parliament didn't sit for a long period of time.
Yeah.
However, Parliament has to be able to oversee and have ultimate control over these laws, especially when we're talking about restricting personal rights and liberties, or we are, overriding the very legislation pursuant to which these laws are made. Now, let me take you back to the initial order that was made by the Governor-General to declare the human biosecurity emergency, and he made that on the 18th of March 2020. Now, that's been rolled over in 3-month periods since then, and it has never been brought to the Parliament for scrutiny. Now, that means that the Parliament of Australia was prevented from scrutinising and, if necessary, vetoing travel bans, the declaration itself, the extension of that emergency provision at those 3-month intervals, and various restrictions that were imposed on people in entering and existing certain areas within Australia. So it is a real issue, and it is not surprising, as I have said, that that this matter has now been brought before the federal court.
Moving on to the actual substantive issue here, though, and that is that there are Australians in India who need to come home. India's now become the second country to surpass 20 million coronavirus cases since this pandemic began. And whilst we obviously need to protect the population here in Australia, I would have thought we need to get Australians out of India so that they're not under the immediate threat of being infected in a country that is suffering through a very, very serious third wave at the moment.
Well, Stephen, this is the point, and it does, I must say, call into question immigration decisions that allowed many Australians of Indian heritage to travel to India during these difficult times in the first place. And I think that whilst the assistance that we're giving to India is very important, there is the very point that you're making, and that is the question that many Australians are asking. And I come back to the point that these are the sort of matters that should be scrutinised by our Parliament. My committee has a notice of motion before the Senate for consideration to give effect to those recommendations. And as I said, without proper scrutiny and without the primacy of Parliament being there to scrutinise these sort of laws, then there is the erosion of the constitutional principle of the primacy of the Parliament. And so therefore, as I've said before, we were so concerned about what has been happening and the trend to have less scrutiny rather than more scrutiny, and that's why we embarked on this inquiry. And Stephen, can I tell you, when you've got a situation where you've got the IPA, Senator Carr, myself, and constitutional lawyers like George Williams and Professor Toomey all agreeing on a particular issue, then you know that it's time for the Parliament to make changes.
Absolutely. Not far off a dictatorship if you make all the decisions without going to Parliament. Connie, great to talk to you. We'll catch up again.